Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Isabella, for joining us, and welcome to the dialogues. Isa, take us away.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first dialogue of a series that we will be hosting to create a space for conversations that need to be happening, especially during a time of pandemic, as well as racial and economic uncertainty like today. As a nation, we are currently reckoning with centuries of systemic inequality and violence towards Black people and other minoritized communities. This is the first of several dialogues where we will address these inequalities and do our part to improve. Please check the Move Emotion social media accounts for upcoming chats every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. The Friday ones will be in English, which is what we're kicking off today. And my name is Isabella Sanchez Castañeda. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am your Move Emotion host today. A little bit about me. I'm an Episcopal Academy alumna and recently had the unique opportunity to graduate from Villanova during a pandemic. I graduated with a communication degree specialized in journalism. And today I am accompanied by two Amherst College alum, Tony Jack and Milton Rico. Anthony Jack is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and assistant professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He holds the Schuster Assistant Professor position at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. His first book, The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Poor Students, explores the experiences of low-income undergraduates and at elite colleges. Thank you, Tony, for being here with us.
No, thank you for having me.
And then we have Milton Rico, who is the co-founder of Move Emotion, a creative collective based in Miami and Colombia that stands for the idea that purpose matters, that our emotions, narratives, and movements matter, and that our connection with each other is ultimately the priority and that makes our personal and professional lives richer. Move Emotion tells stories through the arts and digital marketing in order to help talent and organizations close gaps in their different institutions. Without further ado, Anthony, please start us off with your personal story. Tell us a bit about who you are outside of the classroom and how you got to where you are now.
First of all, thank you all for having me and letting me be part of this important conversation. It is good to be able to engage people all around, from the city in which I live and the city I call home, Boston and Cambridge now, Miami would be my forever home, but also people around the country and around the world. You're absolutely right. This is going to be a summer that I hope more than we don't forget that we always remember, because right now we are going through. It's hard to even find the words about just how much of a possible reset moment that this could be for us. And I say that in an optimistic framing because it takes great upheaval to actually inspire such a reset, right? I don't want us to go back, I hate the term new normal, without talking about the fact that we are able to set the rules going forward, right? We are able to change the rules going forward, to be more equitable, to be more accessible, to be more of egalitarian society in which some of the old inequalities we can actually let go of rather than hold on to so tightly. And so when I think about COVID itself and who's supposedly being hurt by it, and also let's face it, who's also profiting from it, but then also the way in which the loss of Black life, the loss of to police violence, and the groups that we even ignore in that, like Black queer and Black trans women, we need to have a much broader conversation. And so I really appreciate being able to speak about this, because as a sociologist, I may study lower income and first generation college students, but my greater foundation is understanding how poverty and inequality shape the life chances of children and youth. Like, first and foremost, that is what I want. That is what my research focuses on. That's what I do. And so I always say, I'm a first generation college student. Right, my mom is a security guard at a middle school. My brother is a janitor at a hospital and my old elementary school. And I start there because so much of what I do and who I am begins both with those facts with my family, but also my status as being a first generation college student. And I was a Head Start kid, which is something that's very, very important to me, because even though I was unaware of what being in Head Start was, right, that program that gave lower income and families of color early access to childhood education, it changed my trajectory. That was one of the biggest fork in the road moments for me and my family, because I was able to go to a school that was literally across the tracks, right? I went across McDonald Street to go to a slightly better public school that had more resources, and that was less crowded and different things like that. And that put me into a school that had access to honors programs. Then I went to a pre-IB, International Baccalaureate middle school, and then I ended up going into IB in high school. The second, I would say the other biggest fork in the moment for me was I played football in high school. It was my hobby. It was my thing to do outside. It was one thing that I think kept me safe and occupied in between the hours of my mom getting off of work and me getting out of school. But I had a football coach who liked athlete students more than he liked student athletes. And so in my junior year, I was forced to leave that school and end up going to a private school in Miami called Gulliver Prep. And Gulliver Prep was a moment in time that I will never forget, because I owe them both for a wake-up call to just how unequal education was in Miami, but in the country as a whole, because going from a public school that was pretty good with an IB program, but going to a private school with an IB program, and my largest class was 16 students because AP Psychology was just so popular, as compared to my smallest class at Gables was roughly like 25 to 30 students, and that was an IB class. That's the level of inequality difference. My teachers were more often called doctor at Gulliver than at Gables, and just different aspects of the school gave me an opportunity to practice it. And so I was exposed to inequality, but I also realized that I was a beneficiary of some of the practices that lead to some of the inequalities that I hope we talk about today. And so that's cool. You know, that is like kind of like my path. That's actually how I got to Amherst. Amherst found me at Gulliver more so than I found it, because I had never heard of Amherst College before. I tell the joke all the time. Like when I was growing up, there were only 3 Ivy League schools: Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And the only reason why we knew about Princeton was because of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? We didn't know about Brown, we didn't know about Columbia, we didn't know about Dartmouth, right? It was just not in the everyday conversation like Harvard and Yale were. And then the rest, Amherst was like coming up for air, and realizing that you can just chart your own path and do whatever you want, with my first orchestra concert and all those kind of things like that. So it was a lot of fun, but I also developed my passion for narratives. And that actually puts me right where I am right now. Like, I live for the stories, right? The story of the students who I interview, the stories of the institutions that they are trying to write, and where those two collide and align themselves is where I want to be, and be able to bear witness to and write.
It's powerful. I think the idea of narratives actually connects really closely with the purpose at Move Emotion. We really think that a narrative has the power to really touch us at a deeper level, and it also is very rigorous. I think a lot of what we'll talk about is about narratives, and it's really interesting. We also connect with the music piece. What type of music? You mentioned it briefly. I just kind of want to know a little bit more. You mentioned music, correct?
Me or Isa?
No, you.
Oh no! Oh no! I was mentioning. Well, I became much more omnivorous. I became much more omnivorous in my taste when I got to Amherst, because I didn't have an alarm clock. My TV had an alarm setting where you can cut it on, and back then I think it was VH1 actually showed movies all morning from like 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. And so that's what I listened to. But I do teach a course called Cream at Harvard, going back to Wu-Tang, with Cash Rules Everything Around Me. Because I wanted to invite students in, but also to have people let people know who I am a little bit. And so when you can actually reference that song and put it in the course title, we're going to have some fun, but also learn something.
Yeah, and I think to mention about the arts, it's because I think oftentimes we've seen that there are things that we can express with words, but so many more things can be expressed, with music, and with movement, I think a lot of the things that we have excluded, I think, from our curriculum or from our just general attention is really important. It's really valuable, and I think that speaks to, I think, the tone of diversity as well. And I think that's what we're hoping to hear about from your story. I think that's what's great that you jumped in and started to speak about you. Can we talk a little bit more, perhaps personally? So I want to give to everybody a sense. This is going to be a fireside chat. It's going to be focused as well on research. I think we're all here to hear the research that Tony has done, but I do think that it's important to get a sense of the man that's behind the book. So we could just hear a little bit about one challenge you overcame, just to get a sense a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is,
or some.
And I wonder, and I know a lot of people and I think a lot of people in the audience would agree. It's incredibly important to talk about like those big moments that really push you, but sometimes it's the small everyday ones that come at you every other hour that challenge you just as much as those big ones, because you have to have the energy, the will, the desire to keep going along your path. And with every step that you take, that also becomes something that, do I have the energy to go on? Am I still motivated to do something in particular? And so for one thing that was interesting for me was, I'm trying to think, I think so much of in graduate school, right? A lot of what you have to do is just keep persevering through those small challenges so that you can build up the strength to do it. And I realized that a lot of the stuff that, happened in Miami gave me the strength to do that, whether it was, sometimes making ends meet in the most creative ways. When you don't have enough money, when you have to wait the first 2 weeks out of school to get school supplies, like everybody else, because the first paycheck of every school year is always a half a paycheck when your parents work for the actual school board. I remember there's a joke that if I were to call my mom right now, she'll be able to finish a sentence. Every Wednesday and Sunday, McDonald's used to have 29-cent hamburgers and 39-cent cheeseburgers. And that was like our saving grace on the Wednesday before payday. And one day we ordered the cheeseburgers, and the young woman told us to go park. She first was like, "How many do you want?" And then told us to go park the car. And then when she came to the car, drop off the food, she was like, "The hot meat melts the cheese." And we laughed at that moment because it was just so funny how, even though you're running the sale and you want people to use it, when people actually use it to the extent that we had to, it was kind of both dismissive. And so we laugh at that moment now. But it was just like, sometimes you do what you need to do to make ends meet, both inside and outside the classroom. But I was very fortunate to be supported not only by my family, but I also went to Varick Park, which is the park that was down the street from the house I grew up in. And I had a ceramics teacher, Gina Knowles, who I did ceramics all of elementary and all of middle school. And to be able to have that kind of expression in life, that kind of artistic expression that was supported and then actually valued, I felt wanted, needed, and at home in her ceramics room. And then everybody kept asking, "Oh, can you make that for me? Can you make me a chess set? Can you make me a bank?" And actually just a few weeks ago, one of my elementary school teachers sent me a picture of something that I made her. It was a dog that I made her in a ceramics course. And so like different kind of outlets and different kind of things have always been, what challenges you have and you make ends meet. But I've also been very fortunate to be part of some amazing extracurricular activities that fostered my creative side as well.
That's awesome. And you mentioned everybody in the room, and so Isa, were you gonna comment?
I see that more people are coming in, and I did really want to acknowledge just in what you've been saying. I think a lot of us who went to these private schools to get this type of access can really relate to that feeling of, what that really means for us. And then to your point about narrative, right now, I'm so happy to be seeing people creating Instagrams, people creating Facebooks where they're telling their stories, a lot of times painful stories of their experiences at their universities, at their high schools, and just giving so much credit to that narrative right now where we can no longer say, you know, that's not happening out here.
Yeah.
So I do think it's super important, and thank you for bringing up that power of narrative.
Yeah, for those and for those of you who are interested in seeing exactly like this kind of activism in motion, just go on Instagram and start type in Black Act. There are 10 accounts for Massachusetts private high schools. I think Andover, Tabor Academy, Deerfield, and a couple other places. Like it's a growing that people are. It's very akin to the I Too movement that happened in the early 2000 teens, where students at colleges were like, I too am Harvard, I too am Michigan, or we are Michigan. Everybody had different configurations of Michigan, Oxford, a school in South Africa, schools all around the country. Missouri were like saying, I too am a student here. Why are you treating me as a second-class citizen or as if I do not belong? And right now, students and alumni, right? So current high school students and alumni are sending in their stories of, it is really focused on the experience of being a racial and ethnic minority at a private school. So you know that you are going there for the opportunity, going there for the resources, because it's like lower income students, middle class students, affluent students. Many people are contributing. The commonality is they are racial ethnic minorities, and using their voice and using their stories to tell, to share in creating a much more public discourse about what does it mean to be a student of color at a prep school. And it's absolutely powerful, because the interesting thing is the continuing legacy of exclusion that you can actually trace through the comments offered by students and alumni. We're talking about people who are, current students who are literally the age of the children and grandchildren of alumni, and people are telling almost the exact same story. Maybe the brands are different, maybe the names of the dorms are different. There may be a new part of campus, but still the essence of their story and the moment of exclusion still rings true.
And that's it's a sad comment. This whole conversation really started from an Amherst conversation. The Amherst soccer team gets together and we talk about issues and social issues. But this one was about Black Lives Matter. During that time, listening to comments from Baldwin or back in the civil rights, and it all spoke about what's going on currently. And I asked for advice, and one of my peers said, don't try to take what they're saying and then complete the sentence, but just listen and take it in. And I thought, there's no need to complete the sentence, because even back then, like it speaks to the point of where we are at now. But I also don't want to minimize the achievement that you were talking about, all these stories and all these voices coming up and talking about their own narratives. And actually, I want to shift gears a little bit to the next part, where basically we are going to be talking about your book, but we want to talk about three main themes. One of them is sort of the process of becoming through these institutions. How do we gather or gain our voice as minorities, but also just in general as allies? The second part is going to be about systemic challenges that we've seen. And the third part, if we get to it, is basically just how can we take those lessons into the communities that we're in. So let's kick it away. Actually, one of the things I want to do first to start us off is a poll. Go ahead, Isa.
We want to give you the opportunity to tell us kind of who we're speaking to, right? So we want to gauge the awareness in the room. So you can actually check multiple of these, and it is, what is your perception of race and inequality in an educational environment? We'll give you a minute or so to answer that, and then we'll get started with our fireside conversation.
So,
right. So we have about 87% have witnessed institutional racism and economic inequality. and 27% have experienced it themselves. I'm kind of heartened. I'm glad that no one checked the I don't believe. Just glad that we don't have to necessarily address that directly. We're all on the same page that this is really an issue that we're here to address, and it's an issue that has been long overdue for some change.
Funny, is this reflective of your research as we now start to talk about your book, The Privilege Board, or are we speaking to the choir?
You know, the interesting thing is it's important to, and I'm heartened that people don't believe that there's nothing going on. I mean, there are people who are just turning a willful eye to all the structural inequalities that we see. The acts of racism. But I also want us to make sure that we're talking about interpersonal and structural issues, right? We're talking about interpersonal as in what is said from individual to individual, but also structure, the way in which racism and exclusion is written into the policies that we have in our organizations, our country, and the like, right? So we need to make sure, because when we talk about segregation, right? Segregation is not just a present day phenomenon, right? Segregation is part of a long entrenched expression of will in the country. Because what's also incredibly important, I saw an article that said the LA freeway is one of the greatest monuments to, not necessarily to the Confederacy, but to white privilege, in a sense of like how the way in which how neighborhoods have been, how cities have been quartered off by the use of highways and different things like that. Like you think about Miami and other places. But what about the ways in which literally, you know, we are still living with the legacy of redlining and blockbusting, right? The fact that it was perfectly okay and encouraged and legal for people to, you know, to discriminate upon people of color for FHA loans and all that kind of stuff like that, where you had to have additional legislation to come in and say that you can't discriminate against African Americans. Because redlining and blockbusting, for those of you who don't understand, who don't remember it, is redlining was when people used to draw with a red marker on where they would or would not sell to African Americans. And blockbusting is the process in which you would purposely sell to an African American family to increase white flight, to engender white flight. And then once all the white people started to leave, you would buy their house, you would sell that first black person a house at well over market value, because that person, their family looking for a better place to live. But then you would also buy the homes from the white families at lower than property rate, and then again sell it all to black families who wanted to move into a place that was more integrated until it basically went all black, right? And that was a practice. That was okay. That was what they did. And so when you think about, you know, like when I think about racism, right, we cannot just think about it as what racial epithet was used or what way in which you said something or did something interpersonally that was very negative, or that was somehow made people feel a certain way. Those are incredibly important, and we must understand it, because the health consequences of those moments, the health consequences of those racial epithets on children, on adults, we need to make sure that we're tracking, that we understand, but we also have to make sure that we understand how those emotions, those feelings are codified into law and policy.
It's powerful that you're bringing in like emotions into this, and not to think oftentimes we think of that being like soft stuff, and also, but how they translate into policy as well it's real. I think in business we're starting to realize that the discussion about emotions, about all this stuff that usually I guess is seen as soft, is actually the essence of the conversation. And to leave it off, we have another poll eventually to talk about emotions, but we'll also talk about what other types of findings in your book did you think that are key to highlight at this point?
What's important to understand about the work is, one is the origin story of it, but also how it plays out. So when I got into graduate school and started reading, so I came to Harvard for my PhD after graduating from Amherst College. And when I started reading about culture education inequality, everyone spoke about first generation and lower income college students as if they were a monolithic group, right? They spoke about lower income students and said that one scholar put it for an undifferentiated group of students at risk, right? They spoke about lower income students like with very, very broad brushstrokes.
Okay.
But then I thought back to my Amherst College days, and I realized, and I was like, well, that's about half, right? But what about all my friends who went to Andover, Exeter, Deerfield, Choate, St. Paul, Dalton, Hockaday, and all those places, and then Thatcher? Something's not right. They are totally ignoring the number of students who have went to prep schools, boarding schools, and the like, and then that got me. And so when I discovered that on average at one school, one half of the lower income Black students had graduated from private schools, I thought about that for a second. Like, no one was talking about that. But that's also a ridiculously high number for lower income students. And so what I was showing was that elite institutions were hedging their bets, right? They were increasing their student body. They were diversifying their student body by socioeconomic status and by race, but they were going to elite boarding day and preparatory high schools to get that diversity. And so what does it actually mean about mobility in America when for those students to go to a school as prestigious as as Davidson and Amherst and Williams and Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, the odds that happened meant that they had to go to private school first. Why is that so much a pointed thing? And we think about like the racial inequalities in our neighborhoods and in our high schools, we begin to understand why that comes to be. And so that's what my book really started out as, is an examination of an overlooked fact that the pipeline to elite colleges for lower income and or minority students often goes to elite prep schools that are disproportionately wealthy and disproportionately white. And so why is it that to give a youth a shot at going to Harvard, Yale, or Princeton from a lower income background, we have to go through Andover, Exeter, and Deerfield first? And so thinking about those large implications, but then also what happens when those students get to college? Because to only focus on who goes where is missing out on most of the story. What happens from the day students come on campus to the day students leave? What are the ways in which we have ignored what happens in between convocation and commencement, where the real living and learning and mobility possibilities are generated, right? That's what we need to pay attention to. And my research was a deep dive into that.
In the book, you outlined the different types of, I guess, students or minorities that there are. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
I call lower income students who went to private schools the privileged poor. And I call lower income students who go to public schools the doubly disadvantaged. Now, admittedly, these terms are loaded, right? Poor is a very loaded term. Doubly, what are you talking about? The thing is, what I wanted to turn our attention away from was individual differences, and actually let's talk about some societal ones, right? Privileged poor forces you to ask the question, how can someone be both privileged and poor? And that's exactly what the question I wanted people to talk about, because these students were economically poor, but they had the social experiences of being educated and socialized with the top 1%, right? Study abroad was an option for them. Having teachers with PhDs, they knew about office hours, they knew about private jets, they knew about people who have second homes, they knew about summering in other places, right? So they knew about the social cues, right, that helps you integrate into elite schools, both academically and socially. The doubly disadvantaged, however, are not only economic, they also come from poor backgrounds, but they don't have the same level of, they don't have the same access to the social codes and social cues that are needed to more effectively and in an earlier fashion, more easily navigate an elite environment, right? And so by looking at the differences between the privileged poor and the doubly disadvantaged, and also the similarities, I'm able to show how social class works in higher education in a very, very new way.
And that's so connected also to your earlier point of redlining and segregation. You do mention a lot that our system of how we use property taxes to fund our schools is fundamentally broken, and in a lot of ways creates those dynamics where we feel like, you know, the local public school is not going to serve me, let me go to a private institution, and kind of furthering that divide. Can you talk a little bit about that connection?
Yeah, I mean, there's but here's how racialized that process is, right? Yes, we have with the property taxes and the laws that don't allow, you know, money to be spread across these different lines, the different districts, all that kind of stuff like that. But sociologist Pat Sharkey has this very, very interesting piece of finding in one of his research projects. A black family in America that makes $100,000 a year lives in as disadvantaged of a neighborhood as a white family that makes $30,000. Right. So when you think about $30,000 versus $100,000, think about how you have to make 3 times as much to get the same kind of resources. So think about what those resources are, right? You're like literally 30,000 compared to 100 just because of racial differences in America, right? We think about exposure to different kind of inequalities, but also access to resources. Like that's what we're talking about. Think about the school system, think about the parks, think about the streets, think about how many times you have to get a new tire because of potholes and everything else, from something as small as the potholes to as big as the education system that you are able to afford for your family. Right. And so those are like some very, very real racial inequalities that we have to deal with.
That's really powerful. It speaks to my personal experience. I think financial aid and access has increased, I guess, for minorities, right? The access for minorities. And Isabella actually found this in your research that you talk about how access is not enough, that there needs to be more I guess, progress. And one of the things you're talking about here is how making $100,000 for a family of diversity versus another family feels very differently. And that speaks to my own personal experience, frankly. But can you expand a little bit more about it?
There's, I just want us to think about the way in which, it's not just that context matters, but just the powerful imprint on neighborhoods, on everyone's life. There's not a theory, but a stance on equal opportunity where it's saying that we should not be able to go to a hospital and go to the nursery and by just knowing the zip code, be able to predict in the nursery for a 1-day-old baby who's going to jail, who's going to live to C18, who's going to college, who's going to do X, Y, and Z. We should not be able to predict with statistical accuracy based just on zip code and not talent, not drive, not ability, not level of curiosity, right? These are some very, that's where we are right now. And until we move away from that, and I don't even move away from that because like it's something that's like something past, I mean like move away from it as in like address it head on with social policy, right? With actual laws to protect not special interests, but actually the rights and the actual rights of citizens to have even a remote shot at, not necessarily a middle class life, but a stable life, where you are making more of a living wage, where you are doing more living than working.
And can you expand how basically the pandemic and what we're living currently also shows?
The pandemic is exposing us to the racial inequalities that we don't want to talk about. Look who is disproportionately being affected and disproportionately dying, right? There was an article that came out and it was depressing. Black folks who are age 65 are dying at the same rate as whites who are age 75. Across the board, the rates equalize, but there's a 10-year age gap before it does. Just think about that for a second, right? When you think about the health and the vitality of somebody who is 65 as compared to someone who is 75, to say that's when people are equal in the mortality rate, like what does that actually mean, right? Who's more likely to be the essential worker who we are talking about the doctors, the lawyers, but who's more likely to be the essential workers that we're not talking about? The security guards, the janitors, the maids, the custodians, the people who are doing the cleaning up behind a lot of this. Like, so what are the ways in which we are, and people are starting to include people who are sanitation workers, people who work in recycling, people who work in city works in this conversation. But when we think about who's more likely to be like the contingent laborer, right? Who's going to be the, people who are on the front lines, not because of their expertise and training, like with medicine, but because of other people's and who can order food, who has to go to the store, like all of those things. Like, we know that there are racial inequalities and who it affects, and people didn't. It's almost as if they didn't want to talk about it at first. It was almost like this was a footnote that there were more people from racial ethnic minorities being exposed and dying from COVID. And they were like, okay, let's move on. Like, no, this is something we actually need to talk about. Like, it's front and center right now that the infrastructure in America does not support all, right? It disproportionately helps some students, some people, and the racial inequalities that are coming from COVID is showing that front and center.
And
putting that front and center, sorry.
I don't want to veer too far off from education, but to your point, even with the most amount of money in the world, like, we've also been exposed to the fact that our medical system is incredibly racist. And the statistics of COVID patients who go into hospitals and die because of bias against Black people is also something that is incredibly important to address. And every day we see those numbers kind of always skewing against Black people. And
but it's also not. I think your instinct is right. I would go one step further. It is important that we do not separate COVID from education. That this conversation that we are having and the impact that it's going to have on because when you think about education, a lot of people think about mobility, right? What are the things you have to do to be more mobile, to be more to be safe? Like, who are the students when campuses shut down who were most affected by COVID, right? Who went home to a room or to a place where they had access to internet, access to food, access to quiet time for them to study, and who went home to a crowded, if not even overcrowded, but a crowded place where they then had to work hours at a job, whatever they could find, to help make ends meet because they were already working in school, right? And so it's not that COVID is divorced from education or anything that we're talking about. It is integral to it's intimately connected to the two, because anything that exposes just how unequal society is will definitely make its way into the classroom as well. Who was able to easily transition to online learning and who still struggles? There are many students who their only access to internet when they're home is Starbucks, is McDonald's, is the new age internet hotspots when there used to be actual internet cafes. Now you can go to any restaurant and basically sit there as you eat your lunch and be on the internet doing whatever you need to do. But what happens now when you can't congregate in Starbucks or McDonald's? Like, you have no access to internet. There are students it was a horrible picture, but I'm glad they showed it with a reality of someone like being outside, like on the street with their laptop standing outside, in front of one of the restaurants that had internet. I thought it was one of the questions that came in actually from Brian said, what is your biggest, boldest prescription for what elite colleges can do to seriously and fundamentally change? And the first question was abolish test scores. I brought that up because I think one thing that was absolutely horrendous about what happened during COVID is when the College Board was like, oh, we'll let you take it at home, but continued on with everything. I'm like, who can actually say they're going to structure out that much time at home with access to internet, undisturbed, while you're taking the most important test you'll ever take for your chance at going to college? Who's going to be disrupted? Who's going to be asked to help with the elderly parent? Who's going to be asked to change a diaper? Who's going to be asked to help with cooking dinner or doing the dishes or doing something, even when that family really wants to be able to have you have, 4 or 5 hours just to focus on a test? It may not be possible when you have to make ends meet. And right, so those are some real questions that we actually need um, to make sure that we grapple with. But I don't think the two are disconnected at all. I think higher education, education as a whole, is completely shook by COVID, as it should be. The question is, how do we respond? How do we rewrite the norms?
I love it. And I think one of the calls to action from this meeting is really to be engaged. This conversation is the starting point, I think, of many more. But one person was kind enough to donate various copies of your book. So if you reach out to us, we'll see the first 10 or so people that contact us with that request that really want to read his book will get the book. So we'll do that through Instagram. But I guess my point there is that we can start making changes from where we are, no matter who you are and what your, I guess, influence is. And I actually had a mentor write to me after reading your book, Tony, and he said, I had no idea what went through, like what happened with all the diversity, and just really acknowledged how much harder oftentimes people who perhaps don't come from the same background as the majority have to work in order to try to produce results. And you're sort of speaking about that currently. I want to shift, because we are now moving away from education.
We do want to take a second poll of the role of voice and emotions informing our personal identities. Answer which statement best represents the way you've dealt with your emotions and crafted your personal narrative throughout your educational experience. All right, so we have about 20% of our participants saying, I kept quiet and even denied my emotions because it wasn't palatable to most people. We have 15% saying, I spoke about my experiences and emotions, but felt that they were not taken seriously or that they scared people due to the messiness. We also have 25% saying, college was great in every sense for me. I felt connected to everyone. Race and class did not play a major role in my emotional well-being. I spoke freely. And we have 60% saying, I learned to code switch and tailor my communication. I performed a simplified narrative of myself for some people and kept a more messy personal life. It did cut out that little last bit. And so with that in mind, we'd like to give space to Emily to share with us some of her experience so far.
Great. Thank you so much for letting me come and speak here. I was very excited when I found out that you guys wanted me to. So today I just wanted to share a very abbreviated story about what it was like for me being a marginalized individual in a predominantly white environment. So I want to talk about my experience attending the Episcopal Academy and how I and a few others are working to fight the injustices within EA. So to give a bit of background on who I am, my family is a middle-class family. My father is mixed Black and white, and my mother is mixed Chinese and white. And in 4th grade, I moved to Westchester, Pennsylvania, and transferred to Episcopal. And Episcopal is a predominantly white, predominantly wealthy institution, so I already was not like the majority of individuals that attend this institution. So while at EA, I did face a significant amount of discrimination. For example, just to touch on a few things, I had the N-word yelled at me by a white male student the day after Trump was elected. I had a teacher tell me that I was lucky that I had some white in me because it made me prettier than, say, a 100% Black or 100% Chinese individual. But the injustice that I felt was most detrimental to my experience was actually an experience I had with my French teacher in my sophomore year of high school. So this teacher constantly berated and belittled me when I did nothing to deserve it. When I tried to speak up for myself, I would receive demerits saying that I was being insubordinate. And then the most specific instance that sticks out to me the most was one instance in class we were discussing social acceptance within schools. And I was speaking up about my struggles feeling accepted as a mixed woman at EA. And the teacher told me that I shouldn't expect to be accepted because, quote, all of the Black kids only hang out with the other Black kids anyway. So in that moment, he was blaming me for the marginalization that I had faced as a mixed woman in a predominantly white space. And after going through this, I spoke with my parents and we tried to do something about it. And my father spoke with countless administrators at Episcopal, but each and every one of them told us that there was nothing they could do about it. And it wasn't until the teacher did something to a wealthy white student that they actually did anything to the teacher. And so this experience cemented in my mind at the time that EA did not care about me or support me. So for the rest of my time at EA, anytime anything happened to me, I just kind of kept quiet about it because I said, if I speak up, nobody's going to do anything. So taking those experiences with me throughout life and more recently seeing the national movement against systemic racism and come to the forefront, I found myself reflecting on my time at EA and felt driven to devote time and effort to focus EA's attention on equity and inclusion. So I started by writing a letter sharing similarly what I've said today to the school, but I wanted the voices of not just me, but countless others to be heard as well. So with the help of fellow alums, we collected and are still collecting more testimonies from alumni and current students discussing their experiences. And we actually already have over 100 pages of testimonies. And then after we sent those testimonies to the administration, we founded the Episcopal Academy Coalition for Inclusivity and Equity because we wanted this to be more than just a discussion. We wanted to see responsive action and sustained change within the EA community. So we're striving to help EA become a just, anti-racist, fully inclusive institution. And so far, actually, we've been able to collaborate with the board of trustees at EA as well as the administration to have them release a public statement of solidarity. And also we're in the process of creating a concrete action plan to discuss the sort of things we need to do to move forward. So overall, I think just in my time at EA, I witnessed the institution do the bare minimum, at most times nothing, when it came to addressing injustices. And when they did do work, it was standalone work implemented here and there, but it was not interwoven into the mission of the school. So through reflecting on my own experience at EA and helping to found this coalition, I wanted to implement concrete, sustainable change within all areas of Episcopal so that it's not just students coming forward saying, I was treated this way at school, and the school saying, okay, we're sorry about that, and then moving on. We wanted to see actual change happen within the EA community. And then finally, I just want to stress that my story is only the story of one individual. I've shared my experiences with you all and what I'm doing along with others to address the issues within EA, but this is clearly an issue that extends far beyond just EA, and this conversation has shown that. So that's all I really have to say. So thank you for letting me speak, and I am very grateful and very happy to be in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Emily. And something that we were hoping to do is you mentioned that you are bringing up structural change and that this is not solely an EA issue. So because we have the opportunity of having Tony here with us, we would love to kind of ask Tony, what has been your experience with students leading these structural changes? And whether it's at EA or someone here listening is looking to do this at their institution, what is your kind of biggest recommendation for holding an administration accountable and pushing them in that direction?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your story and for your work. The hard part about some of this work for me is that why is it always that the students who are being discriminated against, experiencing racism, experiencing sexism, have to be the one to actually not just bring it to their attention, but also give them a roadmap for how to fix it, right? A lot of my work is really trying to use people's stories to provide that roadmap, because a student shouldn't have to walk from office to office to give the most heart-wrenching and emotional story to every person to get them to believe that they should be a part of it. And so I try to I hope that the book and the work more generally is able to lighten the load of people and actually get people to come to the table before incidents, as you mentioned, and being able to right themselves. The thing is, the students are students have a lot of power. At institutions, students have a lot of power in colleges and high schools. The question is, how do you get the support of the institution? There are two powerful groups at institutions: the faculty and the students. And so for college students, what was really important is for them to have someone on the faculty to sponsor a lot of the work the work that needs to be done, and finding allies, right? So it's incredibly important for students to build an intergenerational network, right? People who have the institutional history, who have the kind of memory to figure out what works, but also know, like, there are certain boundaries that the university can and cannot do, and how do you exploit those boundaries, and how do you actually be part of the conversation? I think a lot, there's always going to be generational differences. I mean, I think if you look at, like, just how powerful, right, social media can be used for all kind of both good and evil. But like right now, the I Too campaign in the early 2000s, on top of that, plus the right now what's happening with, like, Black Act, are incredible moments. So the question is, how do you build a coalition around your cause? Right, that is one of the most important things, because universities oftentimes respond more to outside pressure than inside. Right, if you find that universities are all, in prep schools too, anything that's going to hurt the yield or hurt donations, all of a sudden they listen with a very, very forgiving ear. Right, they are much more likely to listen to you if you start to make so much noise that it's going to hurt the admission yield, the annual fund accounts, and all that kind of stuff like that. And so, building an ally, figuring out what external forces you can use to put pressure on the university or the school, and figure out what are turn your, I don't want to say opponent, but turn your, for lack of a better word, turn your opponent's weaknesses into your strength. If you know that that yield is important to them, right? What happens when you actually tell how racist this school is? How many families will still voluntarily send their child there, right? This is something that many schools were worried about when I was doing my work about an I2M Harvard and Michigan and Missouri and all the other schools were doing. They were like, oh wait, where are these students going to go? We don't want our numbers to drop. And so it's things like that I think you can actually do. But you're doing it right. You're documenting your stories, right? You are not allowing the university, the college, the school, whatever, to just say this is a one-off thing, right? Look at the pattern. There is a pattern. Like, very few white males are saying this, but there are some white women who are saying it. There are even more women of color who are saying it. There are even more, men of color who are saying it. Like, there are patterns here, and saying who is disproportionately affected by it, that's a great way to be.
There's a question from staff librarian in higher education. I'd be interested in hearing your ideas on the best and most useful ways to support students in working for changes.
Yeah, one thing that's also incredibly important is institutions need to, I always say this, they need to question what they take for granted, right? Because the thing is, oftentimes the students who need the most help or who would benefit from our support are those who are least likely to seek it out, or those who are least likely to know how to access it, right? And it's very, very important that we don't wait for students we play catcher, right? For the library, mental health support services, the career service, like all of these offices that make it, that truly are the most important resources of a university when it comes to helping students on that next level, right? You only make it to graduation if you make it. That's why career services, mental health services is so important. You only, you perform well when you know that all the resources the library can do, study abroad office, like how much can you fund? And so the thing is, like, what are the ways in which we give help? We need to rethink how we give help and make sure that we are doing so in a way that is attuned to the different kind of cultural logics that people have. And so it's not just about always focusing on, it's not always focusing on like a radical change in response to this moment. Sometimes the very mundane, everyday actions of an institution is what keeps people, what keeps people separate and keeps the senses unequal. It's those everyday things, and if we begin to address those everyday things that trip people up, and over time it leads to the gaps in how people are performing, we'll be able to have better outcomes that we are more okay with, more aligned with what we want.
Thank you, Tony. I also think, just to speak to exactly what you're saying, I do want to highlight Lauren Ward is on this call, and she is part of the Center of Access, Success, and Achievement at Villanova. And they are an institute, for example, an organization that has taken in first-generation students, students of color, and low-income students. It's open to everyone, but teaches us office hours, teaches us how to go advocate for ourselves in financial aid. And so I do want to highlight Lauren, just because I see that she's there, and also Walida Justice, because I see that she's there.
Yeah, I mean, I've went around the country. I mean, part of, I talk about this in the second chapter of the book, and I've been around the country. I did 75 of 85 book talks, and I still have not met more than 10 faculty members who, before engaging my work, define office hours on their syllabus or in their classes. Right? We assume that everyone not only knew what they were, but knew how to use them, or knows how to use them, and that's just fundamentally not true. And that's why I always, when people ask me for a specific policy, right, sometimes you have to think about what inspires the policy, like the frameworks and the mindset of the people who sit down and write them. And that's why I always ask people, I say, no, like, let's start with something as basic as defining office hours, because the struggle that you are feeling right now in defining something that you've taken for granted for 20 years, that feeling is how students feel every day going to your class. Like, what is this thing that they want me to do? And now roll that out to being not just in your class, but in every facet of the academic environment. And how do we begin to change that?
I see, and I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you, Tony. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a problem that we have somebody from Colombia writing. Unfortunately, all these issues are worldwide, and the pandemic has sort of brought the whole world into thinking about these issues as well. And I hope that this conversation with the 40 of the people who were at the call leads into actions that can touch other communities. And so again, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Isabella. Thank you, Emily. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. And keep posted. We're going to be doing more of these dialogues.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.